I thought I was finally alone, ready to enjoy a quiet afternoon, but what I saw when the door creaked open changed everything. My stepson Jack stood there frozen, his gaze locking with mine. My heart raced as I scrambled to cover myself, but it was too late. The look in his eyes wasn't just shock, it was something else. In that moment, I realized everything was about to change. For years, I believed my life was perfectly stable, if not extraordinary. I was married to Ben, a man who provided a comfortable life, though our relationship had grown distant over the years. Ben was always busy, traveling for work, leaving me with long stretches of solitude that I tried to fill with hobbies and distractions. Yet somewhere deep down, I felt hollow, yearning for a connection that seemed to have disappeared. When Jack moved back in, it was supposed to be temporary. Ben's son from his first marriage, Jack was in his early 20s, a college graduate searching for his next step in life. Tall, confident, and strikingly handsome, he carried an air of maturity beyond his years. At first, I treated him like any stepmother would, polite and distant, trying to respect his space. But something about Jack made it impossible to ignore his presence. The way he smiled, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long, it was disarming. Ben, of course, didn't notice. He rarely noticed anything these days, too absorbed in his work to see how disconnected we had become. My marriage, once filled with laughter and passion, had withered into a hollow partnership. And while I blamed myself for letting it happen, I couldn't ignore the void growing inside me. It wasn't just the loneliness that gnawed at me, it was the realization that I felt invisible. I couldn't remember the last time Ben complimented me or made me feel desired. And yet there were moments when I caught Jack watching me, his expression soft but unreadable. I dismissed it as my imagination, but the warmth I felt from his attention was undeniable. I told myself it was wrong, that I was overthinking harmless glances. But as the days went on, I started noticing the small things. Jack's way of offering to help around the house, how he'd ask about my day, how he always seemed to be in the same room as me when Ben wasn't around. Slowly, an unspoken tension began to grow between us, one I couldn't entirely understand or resist. By the time Ben left for his latest business trip, I had convinced myself nothing could happen. Jack was just being polite, and I was just overthinking. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. At first, I told myself that the glances, the shared smiles, and the lingering moments between Jack and me were innocent. But the truth gnawed at me. There was something in the way he looked at me that wasn't innocent at all. And worse, I didn't want it to stop. Jack's presence became impossible to ignore. Whenever he was near, I found myself hyper-aware of everything. His scent, his movements, the sound of his voice. I tried to dismiss it as a temporary infatuation, a side effect of feeling neglected in my marriage. But the signs were impossible to ignore. Every time our eyes met, it was as if an unspoken understanding passed between us, something that neither of us dared to put into words. The cracks in my marriage with Ben became more apparent as the days passed. His absence was no longer just physical, it was emotional. Even when he was home, his attention was always elsewhere. He never asked how I was feeling, never noticed when I dressed up or tried to spark a conversation. I felt like a shadow in my own home, a presence that didn't matter. And Jack somehow saw all of it. He noticed the sadness I thought I had hidden so well. One evening, as I cleaned up after dinner, Jack entered the kitchen. "You seem quiet," he said, his voice soft, his eyes searching mine. For a moment I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. But the concern in his expression broke something in me. "It's nothing," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." But Jack didn't look convinced. "You shouldn't have to feel this way," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, my heart pounding. There was something in his tone, an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. As the days went on, Jack's subtle attentions became more frequent. He'd linger in the living room when I was there, asking about my day or offering to help with chores. One night, while Ben was away on another business trip, Jack and I ended up watching a movie together. The house was quiet, the air thick with tension. As we sat on opposite ends of the couch, I felt his gaze on me, burning through the silence. "Are you happy?" he asked suddenly, his question catching me off guard. I turned to him, unsure of how to respond. Was I happy? The truth was, I hadn't felt truly happy in years. But admitting that felt too dangerous. "Why do you ask?" I replied, deflecting the question. Jack hesitated, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. I've noticed you don't smile as much when Ben's around," he said. His honesty was disarming, and for a moment, I felt a lump form in my throat. "I'm fine," I said, forcing another smile. But the words felt hollow, even to me. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my mind. Jack's words, his concern, they had touched something deep inside me, something I had tried to bury for years. And while I tried to convince myself that his attentions were nothing more than kindness, I couldn't deny the growing pull I felt toward him. I began to notice little things that I had once ignored. How Jack's gaze lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking, how his voice softened when he spoke to me, how his presence filled the emptiness Ben had left behind. And the more I noticed, the harder it became to push him away. But along with the growing tension came a nagging guilt. What was I doing? What was I allowing to happen? Every glance, every shared moment felt like a step toward something forbidden, something I couldn't undo. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to stop. The next morning, I awoke with a heavy feeling in my chest. The house was quiet, but the tension between Jack and me seemed to echo in every corner. I avoided him all day, keeping myself busy with chores and errands, trying to convince myself that the feelings I had were fleeting, just a byproduct of my loneliness. But by the evening, avoidance was no longer an option. I decided to take a shower, hoping the warm water would wash away the thoughts swirling in my mind. As the water cascaded over me, I found myself replaying the moments I had shared with Jack. The lingering looks, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, the way his gaze made me feel seen in a way Ben hadn't in years. I hated myself for it, but the truth was undeniable. I felt alive when I was near him. Lost in thought, I didn't hear the knock at the bathroom door until it was too late. The electricity had gone out, plunging the room into darkness. Startled, I turned off the water and wrapped myself in a robe. "Anna, are you okay?" Jack's voice came from the hallway, full of concern. "I'm fine," I called out, trying to steady my voice. "The power's out." I tightened the robe around me and stepped out into the hallway, where Jack was standing with a flashlight in hand. The faint glow from the flashlight illuminated his face, his expression tense but soft. "We should find some candles," he said, his voice low. We made our way to the kitchen, the faint light from the street barely lighting the room. As we fumbled around, my shoulder brushed against his chest. I froze, feeling the warmth of his body so close to mine. His hands instinctively came to rest on my waist to steady me, but the touch lingered for a second too long. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice barely audible. But neither of us moved. In the dim light, our eyes met, and the air between us felt electric. I couldn't look away, and neither could he. The space between us seemed to disappear, and for a moment it felt as though time had stopped. "Anna," he whispered, his voice heavy with emotion. His breath brushed against my skin, sending a shiver down my spine. I knew I should step back, say something, do anything to break the moment. But I didn't. I couldn't. Before I could process what was happening, the lights flickered back on, breaking the spell. We both stepped back, startled, like children caught doing something forbidden. Jack quickly moved to check the breaker box, pretending nothing had happened, but the weight of the moment lingered in the air. Later that evening, I sat in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Jack. The way he had looked at me, the way his touch had felt, it was impossible to ignore. I knew I couldn't let this continue, but the pull I felt toward him was stronger than any logic or reason. As if on cue, Jack entered the room, his gaze locking with mine. He hesitated for a moment before sitting down across from me. The silence between us was thick, almost suffocating. "Anna," he said finally, his voice steady but soft. "We need to talk." My heart raced as I nodded, unsure of what to say. He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving mine. "About yesterday. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." You didn't," I interrupted, my voice shaky. "I mean, it's fine. Let's just forget it happened." Jack shook his head, his expression serious. "I don't think I can," he admitted. "And I don't think you can either." His words hung in the air, the truth of them sinking in. He was right, I couldn't forget. I couldn't pretend that nothing had happened, that I didn't feel the way I did. But admitting that felt like stepping off a cliff with no idea what lay below. "Jack," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is wrong." "I know," he replied, his voice just as soft. "But that doesn't change how I feel. Or how you feel." Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked away, trying to compose myself. "We can't do this," I said, more to myself than to him. Jack moved closer, his hand gently covering mine. "I don't want to make things harder for you, Anna. But I can't pretend anymore. You mean too much to me." His words broke something inside me, and I felt the tears spill over. For so long I had been starving for connection, for someone to see me, to care for me. And here was Jack, offering me everything I had been missing. It was wrong, but in that moment, it felt inevitable. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. Every glance, every accidental touch, every conversation with Jack carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. I told myself over and over that I needed to set boundaries, to stop whatever this was before it went too far. But the truth was, we had already crossed that line, and there was no going back. Ben was still away on his business trip, leaving the house eerily quiet. Jack and I fell into an unspoken rhythm, dancing around the tension between us. But one evening, everything came crashing down. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Jack walked in. He leaned casually against the counter, watching me with that same intensity that had started to feel dangerously familiar. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice low and warm. "I'm fine," I replied, keeping my eyes on the cutting board. My hands trembled slightly as I chopped the vegetables, and I knew he could see it. He stepped closer, his presence making it impossible to focus. "Anna," he said softly, his voice right behind me now. "We can't keep pretending this isn't happening." I froze, the knife slipping from my hand onto the counter. Slowly, I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Jack, we can't." "Why not?" he interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "You're unhappy, Anna. You've been unhappy for years. And I can't stand watching you feel like this anymore." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. He was right, I was unhappy. But admitting that out loud felt like a betrayal to everything I had worked so hard to build. "It doesn't matter," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "We can't do this. It's wrong." Jack stepped even closer, his hand gently brushing my arm. "But it feels right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Doesn't it?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth was, it did feel right, terrifyingly so. And as much as I wanted to push him away, I couldn't. Before I could stop myself, I found myself leaning into him, his warmth drawing me in like a magnet. His lips were on mine before I could think, and the world around us seemed to disappear. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened, years of suppressed emotions pouring out all at once. My hands found their way to his chest, his heart pounding just as fast as mine. But then, the sound of a car door slamming outside shattered the moment. I pulled away, my heart racing with panic. "Ben," I whispered, my voice trembling. Jack stepped back, his expression full of regret and something else, determination. "We'll talk later," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in the air. I quickly composed myself, wiping my tears and trying to steady my breathing as the front door opened. Ben walked in, his usual distracted demeanor, giving no indication that he suspected anything. "Hey," he said casually, setting his briefcase down. "What's for dinner?" I forced a smile, my hands trembling as I picked up the knife again. "Just finishing up," I replied, my voice unnaturally high. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Ben barely looked at me, too absorbed in his phone to notice the tension in the room. Jack, on the other hand, avoided the dining table altogether, retreating to his room under the guise of being tired. But the next day, everything came to a head. It started with a knock on the door. I was in the living room when I heard it, the sound sending a strange chill down my spine. Ben was in his office, so I went to answer it, my heart sinking when I saw who it was. Lily. Jack's ex-girlfriend stood on the doorstep, her expression smug and venomous. "Hi, Anna," she said sweetly, her voice dripping with mockery. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning the house like she was searching for something. "Just thought I'd drop by," she said casually, her gaze settling on me. "It's been a while since I've seen Jack." My stomach churned, dread pooling in my chest. "Jack's not here," I lied, hoping she would take the hint and leave. But Lily didn't move. "You know," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, "I've always wondered how things work in this house. Must be hard, being a stepmom and all." Her words sent a bolt of fear through me. She knew. I could see it in her eyes, the way her smile didn't quite reach them. "I think you should go," I said firmly, trying to push past her toward the door. But Lily wasn't finished. "Oh, I'll go," she said, her smile widening. "But first, I think Ben should hear about what's been going on while he's away. Don't you?" My blood ran cold. "You don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaking. "Oh, I think I do," she replied, her tone dripping with satisfaction. "And I'm sure Ben will be very interested to hear all about it." Before I could respond, Ben appeared in the hallway, his expression confused. "What's going on here?" he asked, his gaze shifting between Lily and me. Lily's smile turned sickeningly sweet as she turned to him. "Oh, nothing," she said innocently. "I was just about to tell Anna here how much I admire her dedication to your family." Ben frowned, clearly not understanding the hidden meaning behind her words. But the damage was done. Lily's presence alone was enough to plant seeds of doubt, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. After she left, Ben's behavior changed. He watched me more closely, his questions more pointed, his tone filled with suspicion. And Jack, though he tried to act normal, couldn't hide the tension in his movements. The unspoken connection between us was no longer a secret. It was a ticking time bomb. That evening, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I knew there was no escaping what was coming. The choices I had made, the feelings I had allowed to grow, the lines I had crossed, it was all catching up to me. And when the truth finally came out, I wasn't sure if any of us would survive the fallout. The moment Lily walked out that door, the weight of her threat hung over the house like a dark cloud. I knew it was only a matter of time before the fragile balance we'd been clinging to shattered. Ben had grown more attentive, watching me, questioning me, trying to piece together something he couldn't quite articulate. And Jack, though he tried to stay calm, couldn't hide the tension in his demeanor. I spent the next few days walking on eggshells, waiting for the inevitable. Every glance from Ben felt loaded with suspicion. Every interaction with Jack felt like a risk. The guilt and fear clawed at me, making it nearly impossible to think straight. I had done this. I had allowed this to happen, and now there was no way out. One evening, Ben came home earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen, going through the motions of preparing dinner, when he walked in. His expression was unreadable, but there was a heaviness in his gaze that made my stomach churn. "Anna," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We need to talk." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "About what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Ben leaned against the counter, his eyes boring into mine. "I've noticed things," he said slowly. "You've been distant, distracted. And Jack, he's been acting strange too." My throat tightened, panic rising in my chest. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said quickly, turning back to the stove to avoid his gaze. "Don't do that," Ben said sharply, his tone making me flinch. "Don't lie to me." I turned to face him, tears welling up in my eyes. "Ben, But before I could say anything, the doorbell rang, cutting me off. I felt a jolt of panic as Ben moved to answer it. I followed him into the hallway, my heart sinking when I saw who it was. Lily. She stood on the doorstep, her expression smug and triumphant. "Evening, Ben," she said sweetly, her eyes flicking to me. "I thought I'd stop by for a little chat." Ben frowned, clearly confused. "What's this about?" he asked, stepping aside to let her in. Lily walked past him, her heels clicking against the floor as she made her way into the living room. "I just thought you should know what's been going on in your absence," she said, her tone dripping with false concern. My heart raced as I followed them into the living room, panic gripping me like a vice. "Lily, stop," I said, my voice trembling. But she ignored me, turning to Ben with a sly smile. "You see, Anna and Jack, they've been getting a little too close while you've been away." The words hung in the air like a bomb, the silence that followed deafening. Ben's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, his gaze snapping to me. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I shook my head, my voice breaking. "Ben, Don't lie to him," Lily interrupted, her voice cold. "I've seen it. The way they look at each other. The way they act when you're not around. Ask Jack if you don't believe me." The sound of footsteps on the stairs made me turn, and I saw Jack standing at the top, his face pale. He had clearly overheard everything. Slowly, he descended the stairs, his expression a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Jack," Ben said, his voice trembling with anger. "Is this true?" Jack hesitated, his eyes flicking to me before meeting Ben's. "It's not what you think," he said carefully. "But yes, something happened." The room spun as Ben's anger erupted. "How could you?" he shouted, his voice shaking the walls. "Both of you. In my house, under my roof." "Ben, please," I said, stepping forward. "It wasn't." "Don't," he snapped, his eyes blazing. "Don't say another word." Jack stepped in front of me, his posture protective. "If you're going to blame anyone, blame me," he said firmly. "I started it." Ben's gaze snapped to Jack, his fury redirected. "You think that makes it better?" he shouted. "You think that excuses what you've done?" The argument spiraled from there, voices raised and emotions running high. I tried to intervene to explain, but Ben wouldn't listen. The betrayal was too much for him to process, and by the end of the night, he had packed a bag and walked out the door, slamming it behind him. The fallout was devastating. Ben refused to take my calls, and Jack and I were left alone in a house that no longer felt like home. The guilt and shame were unbearable, but so was the emptiness left in Ben's absence. Jack tried to comfort me, but every time I looked at him, all I could see was the destruction we had caused. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of our actions became impossible to ignore. Ben filed for divorce, and though he didn't explicitly name the affair as the reason, it was clear he wanted nothing to do with either of us. Jack and I continued to see each other, but the relationship was tainted by the pain we had caused. What had once felt thrilling and inevitable now felt like a mistake we could never undo. In the end, the consequences of our actions were far-reaching and permanent. We had destroyed a marriage, fractured a family, and left a trail of hurt that would take years to heal, if it ever did. In the weeks that followed, the house felt like a hollow shell, haunted by the echoes of everything that had gone wrong. Ben's absence was a constant reminder of the life I had destroyed, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the guilt that weighed on me. I had never imagined my life would come to this, tearing apart a marriage, hurting someone who once loved me, and creating a rift in the family that might never heal. Jack stayed, trying to be my support, but it wasn't the same anymore. The thrill, the excitement that had once drawn us together, was now buried under the rubble of what we had lost. He tried to convince me that we could start fresh, rebuild something new, but every time I looked at him, I was reminded of the pain we had caused. One night, as we sat together in the living room, the silence between us spoke louder than any words could. Jack broke it first, his voice soft and filled with regret. "Do you ever wish we could undo it? Go back to the way things were?" I hesitated, tears welling up in my eyes. "Every day," I admitted. "But we can't. We made our choices, and now we have to live with them." Jack looked away, his jaw tightening. "I never meant to hurt you, or anyone else. I couldn't help how I felt." His honesty broke my heart all over again. "I know," I said, my voice trembling. "But sometimes feelings aren't enough. Sometimes doing the right thing matters more." As the days turned into months, I began to piece my life back together, though it was nothing like the life I had before. Ben refused to speak to me, and the divorce proceedings were cold and impersonal. The home we had built together was sold, and the memories we had shared were left behind in boxes and photographs that I couldn't bring myself to look at. Jack eventually decided to move out, realizing that staying would only prolong the pain for both of us. We parted on bittersweet terms, knowing that while we had shared something deeply emotional, it had come at too high a cost. "Take care of yourself," he said as he packed the last of his things. "You deserve to be happy, Anna." But happiness felt like a foreign concept, something distant and unattainable. In the quiet moments, I reflected on everything that had happened, the choices I had made, the boundaries I had crossed, and the lives I had affected. I realized that I had been searching for something that I thought was missing in my life, but in doing so, I had lost sight of what truly mattered: trust, integrity, and the relationships I had taken for granted. If there was one thing I learned, it was that temptation often disguises itself as an answer to our problems, but it rarely delivers the fulfillment it promises. What starts as a moment of weakness can spiral into something far more destructive, leaving scars that take years to heal. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive myself for what I did, but I've learned that healing starts with acknowledging the hurt you've caused and taking responsibility for your actions. It's not an easy journey, and the road ahead is uncertain, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never make the same mistake again. As for Jack, I hope he finds peace in his own way. I'll always care about him, but our story was never meant to have a happy ending. Some chapters are meant to teach us lessons, not define our lives. And as I move forward, I carry those lessons with me, hoping that one day I can rebuild a life rooted in honesty and self-respect, a life I can truly be proud of. If you were in Anna's position, what would you have done? Could you forgive yourself for a mistake that changed everything? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that dive into the complexities of love, betrayal, and redemption. Stay tuned. Our next story is one you won't want to miss.